Somebody asked in the comments if I could talk about super injunctions. And yes, indeed I can. But first I need to just talk about injunctions generally. And one thing I want to mention at this stage is Old Spice, the aftershave. And why is that? Well, it will become relevant, I promise you. So what is an injunction? An injunction is a court order prohibiting somebody from doing something. So that's one thing to remember about injunctions. Generally speaking, you can only stop somebody doing something. You can't force them to do something. Although there can be a bit of an overlap there. Say, for instance, you get an injunction saying you must not allow that retaining wall to fall into disrepair. Well, that's obviously forcing you to maintain the wall. Similarly, you might get something in confidence where you must hand over all confidential documents. So, the idea is the injunction is to stop you disseminating the information, but the part of that is you have to actively hand it all back or delete things or something like that. How do you get an injunction? Well, you can only get an injunction to stop something if you actually have a cause of action in a law. You can't just sort of go, I don't approve of what you're doing, I'm going to injunct you or try to injunct you. So say, for instance, in a confidence case, it might be part of somebody's employment contract that they can't reveal secret information or go work for somebody else. So you want to stop that. Well, you've got a contractual right. So you could bring a claim in contract saying, you're in breach of contract by disclosing this information or working for somebody else. What if you need an injunction to stop somebody performing a dangerous activity that might hurt you? Well, you'd have a claim in personal injury, if they were to hurt you. So that gives you your cause of action. So that's what you need. You can apply for an injunction before actually, a full case. So we call them Kia TMET injunctions. They're injunctions stopping somebody doing something pending resolution of the final issue. Sometimes, though, the injunction is all you want. You might just want the final injunction. You want to stop somebody protesting outside your premises. I mean, that might be a claim in harassment or trespass or something like that. But, the injunction is all you want. That's the final final outcome. So the test we use for an injunction, it's something called American cyanamide, and that's after the particular case that sort of developed these rules. So the rules are, first of all, you must have this, cause of action. The second rule is that damages must not be an adequate remedy. So if you say, well, look, I want an injunction to prohibit somebody doing something. Why? Well, I think it's going to cause me harm. Well, yeah, okay, if that harm actually crystallised, damages might be enough. So you've got to show, and it can be something like, say, in a personal injury claim, you can say, I want somebody to stop hurting, doing this because it puts me at risk. And damages won't be an adequate remedy. Now, obviously, there is a bit of a contradiction there because in personal injury claims, we do say damages are an adequate remedy because that's all we have. I mean, one thing to remember is at common law, damages is the only remedy. They can only give you money. So injunctions, they arise in equity. They're a form of equitable release. What else do you need to do? You need to give a cross undertaking in damages. So you have to promise and say, look, if this injunction is granted, and then it turns out it shouldn't have been, and the other side have suffered a loss as a result of the injunction, I will pay them. I will pay them damages. We look at what's called the balance of convenience when it comes to granting an injunction. So it's probably best to explain by example. Say, for instance, you want to stop somebody cutting down a tree. You say that actually that tree's on my land. So, it's a form of what we call conversion. It's you treating somebody's property as your own. So if they chop it down and it turns out that when we go through all the deeds and all the land registry stuff and all the historical documents, it turns out it was my tree. Well, if it's cut down, what's the, how do you remedy that? You can't sort of put it back or glue it back together. Now you can say, oh, well, we'll compensate you for the loss of the tree. But you say, well, no, it's irrevocably lost there. So if you don't grant the injunction, the tree will be chopped down. If it turns out I should have had the injunction, there's nothing you can do about it. But the flip side is, let's say you say, okay, you can't chop that tree down until we resolve this. And then it turns out actually they were entitled to chop the tree down. Well, but what have they lost out on? I mean, realistically, they just have to wait a little bit longer to chop a tree down. So if that wasn't blocking anything, like a building project or something, you say, well, actually, it was less inconvenient for you. So therefore, we are going to, that's the balancing exercise that you actually do. So yeah, I mean, that is pretty much it when it comes to sort of just an injunction. The other thing is, if it's very finely balanced, the idea is that you preserve the status quo. So how do you apply for an injunction? You apply on just a standard application form, an N244. You've got to put evidence in to say why you need the injunction. So you put a witness statement in. There are some things you can't injunct. You can't injunct potential defamation. So if you say somebody's about to publish something that's completely defamatory about me, it's tough. We have a doctrine of what we call no prior restraint. So in that particular case, they say no, damages will be the appropriate remedy. Because that's what we award in defamation all the time. But what if they say it's a confidence case? Like, here's some secret confidential information. And if this gets out, you can't put the cat back in the bag. So in that particular case, they're more likely to grant the injunction because, if it turns out, you didn't have a right of privacy and they were allowed to publish, well, they've just had to wait a little bit longer to publish. And if they say something like, well, as a result of this, we lost sales on our book, that's where your cross undertaking in damages comes in. So what's a super injunction? A super injunction, I do have some experience of these, but obviously I can't talk about them. A super injunction is where not only do you get the injunction, the existence of the junction is itself not to be disclosed. And this is something that crops up a lot in confidence and privacy cases. The one I had was actually it was a blackmail case. So somebody was threatening to reveal some information. Now, if the existence of the junction was made public, it would say in there, this particular person is not allowed to disclose the following information about the claimant. Well, that defeats the entire purpose of the injunction because it's like, well, people go, well, hang on a second, you had a genuine right to keep this secret because it was a blackmail attempt, but now just reading the information, even if we say, well, none of this is true, or it could be true. I mean, I'd say you can't get an injunction in defamation, but you can sometimes get them in blackmail or harassment. Also, if it's a mixed confidence stroke defamation case, so it's like all this information is secret. This is, the nanny's spilling the beans on what happened in our house, and that's in breach of her employment contract. And as it happens, everything she's saying is untrue anyway. You can get the injunction on the back of the confidence claim. But that's what a super injunction is. Like I say, it's just one where you can't even reveal the existence of the injunction. So there you go. There are some exceptions to that. Like sometimes they will say you don't have to do the crossing undertaking in damages if you're sort of impoverished and you're up against a very, very rich person. So why allspice? It's just the fact that American Cyanamid used to own the rights. They were the company that made allspice. So whenever judges say, Mr. Robertshaw, please address me on American Cyanamid, I always like to slip in, actually, they're the company that used to own allspice. So there you go. I hope that answers your question. I mean, like I say, I can always go into a lot more detail about this, you want, because, injunctions are something that, crop up in everyday life. I mean, a very common one is a non-molestation order, which is, a type of injunction. So, in family disputes with, DV cases, you can literally just run down the court. I mean, you get these very quickly. You can turn up at the court office at sort of 9:30 and go, I need to get this, an injunction now to either get somebody out of the house or stop somebody hitting me or keep somebody away from me or something like that. And they'll stick you on. Now, in that case, the injunction is made, it's what we used to call ex parte. We now say it without notice. You don't tell the other side because you just need it so quickly. I mean, if it's something, there is a sort of convention now that we've got email and telephones. They say, well, actually, look, you can let the other side know and it's up to them if they turn up. But if an injunction is granted without the other side being there, you do a return date. So within 72 hours, they can actually come the other side can come to court and say whether, argue, say no, this injunction, shouldn't exist. It should be lifted. So they do get their chance to challenge this. Who do you make injunctions against? It's funny because I do a lot of the animal rights stuff, the protesters. So half of my clients base is persons unknown, because they make the injunction, and we have this debate as to whether it's a person who is unknown or a person that's not been identified. And the example I use is, you come out one morning and your car's vanished, it's been stolen. It's been stolen by persons unknown. But you come out and you actually see the person getting in your car and driving off with it. You might not recognise them or know who they are, but they are not a person unknown, they're just a person not identified. So now they've said to people, like, if you want to serve this injunction on somebody, you're going to have to identify them. So it can be things like, this is an injunction against the guy who wears the animal rights t-shirt and the bobbly hat who stands outside this particular shop on Oxford Street. So you don't necessarily have to do names. Injunctions can be in personam or in rem. In personam means it's a specific person or people that are identified as the defendants and the people who are injuncted, and it only applies to them. An in rem injunction is one that applies to everybody who becomes aware of it. They had that in the Spycatcher case. They made an injunction saying nobody can publish this book, and anybody who publishes this book, being aware of this injunction, is in contempt of court. So they can be sort of quite wide-reaching. But this is the interesting thing about super injunctions, because you can't be in breach of it if you don't know about it. But what they will tend to do is, when I used to work at the newspapers, they will serve copies of the super injunction on all the newspaper offices and say, right, there's an injunction in place, you can't talk about it, you can't even mention this injunction. One place you can mention them is in Parliament, and people have actually used parliamentary privilege to reveal the existence of super injunctions. So there you go. As always, hope you found that vaguely useful, vaguely interesting. Sorry that was a bit incoherent. It's absolutely freezing here. I've come to the top of something called Carn Brea to film at the castle, which is that thing behind me, which is actually now a really nice restaurant. It was actually built in the 1500s as a hunting lodge. So it's never actually been a castle, it's just a very expensive folly, but it is quite pretty. I might try and get some footage for you before I get blown off the top of this hill.